All right, good morning. So, allergy season has not been kind to my voice, so maybe we'll have a nice quick class here when I run out. This is the last class on this particular topic that we've been looking at, which is a certain aspect of what makes something look like an eyewitness testimony. And we looked at something called undesigned coincidences, which is that different eyewitnesses remember different details, but they can kind of unintentionally coincide and make a fuller explanation. Now, when we looked at the Gospels, we looked in the format of you're reading one Gospel and a certain question might come to your mind. You read a different explanation in another Gospel and it answers the question. And it's a subtle thing, so obviously the different Gospel authors weren't coordinating or trying to explain each other. And that's how eyewitness testimony actually works. There are subtle ways in which eyewitnesses can explain each other, can complete each other's explanation. Now, I mentioned that police are accustomed to this phenomenon because they have to interview eyewitnesses, and no two eyewitnesses tell the story in exactly the same way. In fact, there was a detective in California named J. Warner Wallace, and he was a very good detective, and eventually he was assigned to the hardest cases, which are the cold cases. You might have seen TV shows about trying to solve cold cases, and it's very, very difficult. And he was an atheist, he was a skeptic, and he started reading the Gospels in his mid-30s because someone had told him that these were like eyewitness testimonies, and he was very skeptical. And when he read them as a skeptic, he started to get very interested. And one of the things that interested him was that the different Gospels didn't tell the same story in exactly the same way. Now, to a lot of people, even to Christians, this is somehow troublesome. But to him, it was like, yeah, that's the way eyewitnesses work. They're not in collusion with each other. They're not just quoting each other. Different people remember different things when they witness it. But when they fit together without contradiction, when they can be made to give a fuller story, that looks like eyewitness testimony. And he actually became a Christian eventually because of examining from the viewpoint of a detective from forensic science. And he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity on that subject. And he also wrote the afterword for this book by Lydia McGrew that I've been using for these examples, in which he mentioned that in the detective world, they had a phrase, unintentional eyewitness explanation. That's the same thing. It's eyewitnesses unintentionally explaining each other, even though they're being interviewed separately, and so on. And he also quotes in the afterword from the instructions that judges in California are required to give to juries. And one of the things they have to say is, if eyewitnesses don't say the same thing, do not discount their testimony. Judges have to instruct the jurors. That's not a problem. That happens in every court case we have, so that's not an issue. And so this is something that we looked at in the Gospels. Last week, we looked at the first set of Paul's epistles and how they coincide with stories in the book of Acts. And we'll continue and finish that today with some examples, and then we'll give kind of the big picture about Paul's epistles in the book of Acts. So just a couple of brief examples. You might know the story that on Paul's first missionary journey, halfway through, Mark left and went back to Jerusalem. Then, when Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Mark were all in Antioch and they were about to leave on the second missionary journey, there was a dispute. Paul said, I don't want to take Mark because he left us halfway through the first journey. And Barnabas stood up for Mark and was arguing, no, Mark is a good worker, we should take him. Now, a lot of times we explain that because we say, well, Barnabas, that's another example of Barnabas being a very encouraging man. In fact, when you look at his introduction to us in Acts chapter 4, you find that his name wasn't even Barnabas. His name was Joseph. Barnabas was a nickname that was given to him, and it means son of encouragement. It was a nickname because he was such an encouraging person. Bar in Aramaic is like adding S-O-N on the end of a name in English, Johnson or something, son of John. Barnabas means son of encouragement. It's not a normal name really back then because nobody's dad was named encouragement. So this was a nickname given to Joseph of Cyprus in Acts chapter 4 because he was so encouraging. But is that the whole explanation? Was he sticking up for Mark just because he's that kind of personality? Well, at the end of Colossians, when Paul is giving his greetings to people, and when he's saying, here's the people who are with me who send you greetings, he says something interesting. Among the people who are with him who send their greetings to the Colossians, Mark, cousin of Barnabas. So now it fits together into a more complete picture. Yes, Barnabas was an encouraging type of person, but he was also sticking up for his cousin, Mark. So it's a little bit clearer when you piece together two different sources that are not trying to explain each other, but together they make for an explanation. And another brief example, when Paul is writing to Timothy, his mother and grandmother, Lois and Eunice, are mentioned as having imparted knowledge of the Scriptures, imparted the faith to him from an early age. But Paul doesn't mention his father. So what's the story with Timothy's father? You jump over to the book of Acts, and when Timothy first appears in the book of Acts, Luke calls him the son of a believing Jewish woman, but his father was a Greek. And then we find that in order to enter the synagogues and preach together, Paul had Timothy circumcised so that it wouldn't be objectionable to the Jews. So in other words, the picture we're getting now is that Timothy's father did not have him circumcised because he was not a believer, because he was a Greek. And we piece together what we find in 2 Timothy with what we find in Acts, and we get a more complete picture of Timothy's family and upbringing. Another example from Acts and the Epistles is a worker named Aristarchus. Now, Paul, at the end of the book of Acts, is under arrest in Rome. And he is writing, though, and he makes reference in some of his epistles to the fact that he is bound, that he's in chains. And so we call those prison epistles. Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians and Philemon and 2 Timothy are all called prison epistles because of Paul writing them from Rome when he was under arrest. In Colossians, same verse that had Mark, cousin of Barnabas, there, he's giving his greetings, and he says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. So Aristarchus is with him in Rome. In Philemon, another prison epistle, he's listing who's with him as co-workers, and he lists Epaphras, Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke. So, according to these prison epistles, Paul has Aristarchus with him. And then we jump over to Acts, and we find back in Acts chapter 27, when they're about to sail on the boat that's going to have a shipwreck and they're going to wash up on the shores of Malta, the island, eventually make it up to Rome. When they're about to get on the boat, Luke says, Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So this has the feel of Luke is an eyewitness to what's happening. This is one of the we and us passages of Luke. Luke was on the boat too. And Luke tends to record a lot of detail. Some of the detail isn't really necessary to the story, but that's kind of the way eyewitnesses do too. Eyewitnesses tell you things that aren't absolutely essential to the story. And what we get from Colossians and Philemon is the flavor of something that's really written by Paul while he's imprisoned in Rome. And so it all fits together, and they support each other as being the type of things that were written close to the time by witnesses. And there's lots of other connections between Philemon and Colossians also. And that'll be important in just a minute. But here we have three different books interacting: Colossians, Philemon, and Acts. Now this is kind of a really subtle thing. The last example, to be in chains was often used as a generic term. You're in jail, you're in prison, you're confined in some way. You might or might not be wearing any chains. You might be wearing one chain. You might be wearing 4 chains in a jail cell. But to be in chains was a term for being restrained. But there was a much more specific term in the Roman Empire, in the writings, Greek and Latin writings from the era. To be bound with a chain, singular, had a very specific meaning. It means you were tied to a soldier with one chain, and the soldier was guarding you. So you had a little more freedom to walk around and whatever, but you can't escape. No point killing the soldier. You're not going to drag him with you. You're bound by a chain here. So you could say I'm in chains, plural, and that could be any situation, including the situation of just one chain. But every time in literature of the era that a chain is used, it really does mean one chain, and it means you're tied to a soldier. Now, this distinction gets lost, unfortunately, in almost all of our translations of Ephesians 6, verse 20. I'm sure that any translation that any of you has with you today, if you look at Ephesians 6:20, you'll see that it says, Paul says something like, I'm an ambassador in chains, plural. But the translators didn't see the point of saying I'm an ambassador in a chain, because that sounded funny to them. An ambassador in a chain? They used the more common phrase, ambassador in chains. Now, there are some very, very literal translations that we don't typically read because they're hard to read, that show what Paul wrote was, I'm an ambassador in a chain. And as odd as that sounds, it's a sign that Ephesians was one of these prison epistles that Paul was writing. And the reason he used that phrase is because it does agree with what we read in Acts. In the last chapter of Acts, Acts 28, verse 16, Luke says Paul was guarded by a soldier. And then in verse 20, when Paul is speaking on his own defense, he says, in fact, it is for the hope of Israel that I'm wearing this chain. So the picture we get from Acts 28 is Paul is tied to one soldier by one chain. And he uses that language, and then he uses it in Ephesians. So the books are connected and they agree with each other. Now, why is this eyewitness testimony important? Well, as we mentioned before, some scholars who are skeptical say that Acts wasn't necessarily written by Luke. It might have been written much later by some follower of Paul, in which case it wouldn't really have eyewitness reliability. Likewise, there are certain epistles that all of the scholars say were written by Paul. And there are some others that they say were written later, not by Paul. Well, if either Acts or half of Paul's epistles were written later, they really shouldn't look like eyewitness accounts that agree with each other. It would be very hard for decades apart authors who weren't eyewitnesses to have these subtle interconnections like you see in eyewitness accounts. So what we've seen is a testimony that these really all do look like eyewitness accounts. Last week, all the examples were from the epistles that every scholar say Paul wrote and the book of Acts. This week, all of the connections were from the other epistles, the ones that the skeptical scholars say Paul didn't write, and the book of Acts. So actually, we had this one example of Acts and Philemon and Colossians all coinciding. And amazingly to me, some of the skeptical scholars say that Paul wrote Philemon, but he didn't write Colossians, that it was written later, which I find kind of amazing because there's a huge number of connections, considering how short the books are, between Philemon and Colossians. Early in Colossians, it even says the Colossian church is a house church at Philemon's home. So, but in any case, from each of these two supposed groups of epistles of Paul, each of them has the kind of eyewitness connections to the book of Acts. They have the same nature. These two different sets of Paul's epistles have the same eyewitness nature, so there's really no particular reason to divide them into two sets and say one set was written by Paul and one set wasn't. They do, in fact, all have the same flavor. They all look like eyewitness testimony. So, Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Timothy, we looked at today. For some reason, some skeptical scholars say these were written later, not by Paul. But they all bear the same eyewitness signatures as the other epistles that they say were written by Paul. So that tends to make you think that actually they were all written by Paul. So that's all I have for today and all my voice has, so thank you for that.